groups at the conference. We wanted to start right off the bat talking about some of the big issues and thinking about a national response, national policy, and so immigration is right there at the front. You know, there are many ways that police and law enforcement and the criminal justice system are used against people labeled as gang members. And one of the ways that that happens that's not always recognized is through deportation. That removal proceedings are one of the government's gang suppression strategies. So this panel will be able to deal directly with that, both in terms of how it looks in the community, why it's an important issue, also how it's been playing out in courtrooms and immigration courts over the last several years, and finally, what we can look forward to for the next several years. So we're going to have 3 presentations. The first is going to be from 2 community activists, Alex Goodwin and Sanat Sobravia from Organized Communities Against Deportation. Alex is from BYP 100. That will be followed by Professor Leila Halas, who was one of the authors of a survey of gang allegations in immigration court, a survey of immigration lawyers that was the best really statistical quantitative look at what was going on at least a couple of years ago. And then finally, we're going to hear from Julie Mao from the Just Futures Law, who's really, I think, going to tell us about what we're looking forward to and what's emerging in this field. So let me give you a quick introduction to Sanat. She leads OCADs, that's the Organized Communities Against Deportation in Chicago. She leads their deportation defense work by connecting people threatened with deportation to OCAD's network of attorneys. She's an expert, she's an expert in connecting legal defense and organizing. And for those of you who don't know her organization, it's an intergenerational collective who comes together to fight against deportations and criminalization in Chicago. They describe themselves as undocumented, unapologetic, and unafraid. Their work includes supporting the defense of people in removal proceedings and advocating for policy changes such as expanding Chicago sanctuary laws and ending the use of Chicago PD's gang database, which for years was used as a basis for denying sanctuary to immigrants. And Alex is currently a deputy campaign director at the Action Center on Race and the Economy. She organizes with BYP 100 Chicago and is a co-founder and writer with Left Out magazine. Her writing and activism are centered around the momentum and challenges of building Black power and self-determination. Her work at ACRE currently focuses on the relationship between the finance industry and policing, racialized capitalism, and how these things exacerbate oppressions. So I'm going to turn it over to the 2 of you. Thank you.
Cool, thanks, y'all. I'm gonna take a second to do a screen share, our favorite tech tool. Okay. And can folks see this, what's on the screen? Okay, cool. So yeah, this is just our title slide. As Sean shared, my name is Alex. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm a member of BYP 100, and I'll be facilitating today with Sanat. Cool. Okay, so Sean shared a little bit about our organizations. I'll talk about BYP 100, and Sanat, if you want to add anything about OCAD, you should. But BYP 100 is a national all-Black, Black-led direct action organization. We have chapters around the country and one in Chicago in particular. Yeah, our work in Chicago looks like being a part of the Defund CPD campaign, being a part of the campaign to get rid of the gang database, and participating in mutual aid projects.
Yes, and I'm Shanad. I also use she, her pronouns, and I'm part of OCAD, a non-documented group, like Sean was saying. We started in 2013, coming out of Immigrant Youth Justice League. So undocumented young people getting to know each other and trying to navigate being undocumented, and then figuring out the deportation and trying to intervene in that situation felt needed and right for us. And so we created OCAD. And that's how we've also been learning how the criminal justice system and all of that kind of intertwines and impacts each other.
Cool. So just a couple of disclaimers before we get into the rest of the presentation. We know that we still have a lot to learn about the gang database in Chicago and gang databases in Illinois, gang databases around the country. We are not necessarily the experts. We are just going to be sharing our experiences and things that we've learned from our experiences. We also recognize that together we know a lot. And so I would encourage y'all to be interactive in the chat, share your own experiences and the questions that you have while during our next 20 minutes. And then also important to name that myself and Shanat and our organizations are a part of a larger coalition of grassroots groups, legal services under the same goal to expose the gang database and end the biased practice of gang designation. And the goals over the next 20 minutes, we want to present a timeline of our campaign in Chicago to erase the gang database. And we want to use this timeline as a way to talk about strategy, talk about our challenges and our wins, and then also present a summary of how CPD uses the gang database. Getting us into the beginning of the presentation and how we even came to the gang database as a target for demands. This came out of Chicago's fight for and against the city's Welcoming City Ordinance. Organizers found at the time that the Welcoming City Ordinance which was supposed to be to establish Chicago as a sanctuary city, had carve-outs that included that if you were in the gang database, you were essentially not covered under the sanctuary carve-outs of the Welcoming Cities Ordinance. And so with that, our demands became that we protect all Chicagoans from immigration enforcement by eliminating the carve-outs, eliminating CPD's gang database, create policies that decriminalize and reduce arrests, and decrease police funding and invest in Black and Brown communities. And I think it's really important that number 4, because we've gone back and forth in the campaign about reparations and have come to agreement that it's a really it's an important word for us to use, an important thing for us to fight for as we get rid of the gang database. And so again, we're using this campaign to identify the gang database as a racist tool that criminalizes Black and Brown communities and also creates a pipeline to both incarceration and deportation. And we recognize that the gang database is one way to attack the system of racialized surveillance, criminalization, incarceration, and deportations. And because these things disproportionately impact Black and Brown communities. And I'll pass it over to Shanat.
Yeah, so we want to talk a little bit about what we know so far. And it's been through FOIAs, it's been through lawsuits, and it's been through lived experiences of people in the community that we have gathered the information that we can share today. We know the Chicago gang database that dates back to the 1980s. Right now, it comprises over 161,000 people in it. 128,000 approximately are adults and 33,000 are young people. We know that 95% of the people listed are Black and Latinx, being 70% being Black, 25% Latinx, and 5% or a little less white. We also know that this means that 11% of Chicago's Black population is in the gang database, 4% of the Latinx population is in the gang database, and 0.6% of the white population is in the gang database. And just to put it into context, because we know that gang databases exist in other states and other cities. I mean, there's even a country, national, and international databases. We know that California, as of 2018, had 100,000 people, while New York had 17,500. And just to put it into context, Chicago has over 161,000, increasing every day. And then how does it impact us? I mean, oh, sorry, Alex.
Sorry, also, these are some of the ways we understand people to end up in the gang database. I think this first point around officers having unlimited discretion is really, really important because it essentially is giving CPD the authority to label anybody a gang member based off of their own expertise or knowledge. Yeah, I think that's really important to name. I think it also speaks to the numbers that Shanat just shared around who is in the gang database, because we know that our communities on the like Black and Brown communities in particular are over policed. And so, of course, there's going to be more Black and Brown people in the gang database. There are more police in their neighborhood. Picking folks up with some of these things that are listed here, like tattoos, clothing, use of signals or symbols, information provided from a third party or another CPD officer. CPD is also using social media. And then there's a bullet point around people who have like self-admitted to being gang members, but I think there is a lack of credibility there as well, understanding the way police operate, yeah, and get folks to admit to harm. And so also with that, we know that police don't need any evidence to support gang designation. This is the self-admitted piece. 88% of people have supposedly self-admitted to gang membership, but there's no documentation or criteria. And 11% of the people in the gang database have no reason listed for their inclusion. Okay, I think, is this one also me, Shanat? Okay, thanks. So we understand that the gang database is fueled by CLEAR, which is Citizen Law Enforcement Reporting and Analysis. And this is where CPD is inputting the information that they collect from gang arrest cards and investigatory stop reports. And you'll see the numbers here, just like looking at the number of investigatory stop reports, 145,000 people have been hit with these reports and cards, which, yeah, it's just is a massive amount of people that police are stopping and then including in the gang database.
Yeah, and so usually don't know where, when, and if you're in the database. Usually you're finding out by how you're being treated, impacted. And so here are some ways that we've seen people being impacted by being in the gang database, oftentimes learning that they're in the database afterwards. We know that immigration, it impacts immigration. So as OCAD, we've seen a lot of folks go into court and then the government, arguing with the judge, saying that the person is in the gang database, is a gang affiliated, and therefore should not be granted bond or relief. We know it has impacted people's access to employment. We also know that people find out when bail is being denied or bond. It impacts parole and the way you're able to come to your community. Oftentimes we find limitations as to you cannot be associated with so-and-so, and that means oftentimes family in your neighborhood. It impacts parental rights, increases police harassment. So we know people being pulled over for a traffic violation, instead of one cop car, it's two, and it becomes really aggressive. Unreasonable search and seizures. It impacts licenses, work, and also, for different kinds of careers. Education, we've seen that impact also people's access to education. And then, yes, false arrest, false imprisonments. And so there's a lot of impacts beyond, just being in it. And so we're gonna put, is it one slide? Yes. And so us as an OCAD, and here in Chicago, we started exploring this and seeing this. I mean, we had the case of one of our members we met, whose home was raided in 2017. It was very violent. 7 ICE officers came and detained him. We learned that ICE justified their presence by saying that he was in the gang database. Ahmed had no clue. But then we found out, as Alex mentioned, it was 2 police interactions, 2 separate times where he was placed on it. And this was after Hoyas and litigation. We actually was the first one in Chicago to sue the city of Chicago for being placed in the gang database and having all these consequences. So that's how we started learning a little bit of what clear and how difficult it is to know and how impossible it is to get out of it too.
So another part of our organizing, or a piece that's been really important to our organizing, is research. We have folks within the campaign coalition who took on a lot of this research to better understand how the gang database works and how CPD is using it. And so that's the UIC Policing in Chicago Research Group, who produced these reports here: tracked and targeted, expansive and focused surveillance, and then also some research on the county's database. And I think that also, like, this research was really important because it wasn't done by the city, right? It was done by organizers and people who understand and believe in this issue. And I think also was part of what inspired or pushed our the Office of Inspector General, which is Chicago's like independent auditor, to do their own research and investigation into the police department and their use of the gang database. And yes, we are like also directly organizing our folks. So there have been, we're using tactics such as like teach-ins and political education online and in person and now online, to tell people more about the gang database and move people towards contacting their alderperson and saying that that this thing doesn't work and we don't want CPD using it anymore. And then, sorry.
Yeah, and also we sued the city ourselves. Several organizations filed a class action lawsuit along with 4 or 5 individuals as well. And it was BYP 100, OCAD, Mi Gente, BPNC, Blocks Together. We all went in, and I think it was a 1-year-long lawsuit. If we go to the next slide, in the lawsuit, we were able to argue, we were able to argue due process protections, notice of gang designation to people, and the sharing of the information, incorrect information many times, to third parties. We came later to know that it's 500 third parties that actually gather and use the gang database information. So those were the grounds. We knew that the lawsuit wasn't going to be the place where we get rid of it. We knew it was a place to get information exposed. So one of the things that we didn't settle as organizations, but the individuals did settle back in last year. And they did get compensation for the harm that they received. And so that has informed also our thinking through the ordinance and what we are going to then be fighting for here in Chicago through policy.
Sorry for the slide mix up there, y'all. It's also coordinating little people in the background. So also it's important here that we're holding our elected officials accountable to fight for this. And so in 2019, we were able to halt the use of the Cook County gang database, which is really exciting, and shows again that getting rid of gang databases are possible. As I mentioned before, also in 2019, the Inspector General released a report confirming that CPD's gang database is filled with errors. And right now, our strategy has moved into pushing city council members to support the community restoration ordinance, which we're going to talk about in a second. But I think Chicago is a special case because we have 50 city council members which is just like a daunting number. And we've been meeting with folks now for, I would say, a couple years on this issue. And I think that like our campaign is in a place where, yeah, where we're actually going to win and pass this ordinance. Got to speak it into existence. And so the community restoration ordinance, this is a look at some of the language that's in the ordinance, but an overview essentially is that it will get rid of the gang database and also establish these peace commissions, which are a form of community-led violence interruption and prevention. So there are young people in Chicago in an organization called Good Kids Mad City. And shout out to Miracle if she's still on here. But Good Kids Mad City has been pushing for the city to institute or establish the Peace Book. And as part of the Peace Book, there would be these peacekeepers and commissions in each ward who would be able to conduct peace negotiation and violence interruption. And we think that that was a very important piece. And one of the reasons that we felt like there should be a combination of our fights between getting rid of the gang database and instituting the Peace Book, because the gang database, again, is an example of the way the state criminalizes us simply for being Black and brown and living where we live and keeping the people around us that we keep. I think another important thing here is that being a gang member is not illegal, and that oftentimes people move into gangs for to have their needs provided for because the state is not doing that for us. And so this ordinance here is a way that's going to like provide reparations and make structural change around the way the state has been criminalizing folks. So I don't mind reading the stuff that's on the slide, but the CRO would disrupt the cycle of criminalization by dissolving the database, and prohibiting CPD from creating any new gang database. It won't be able to share, CPD won't be able to share data with other agencies and would provide compensation modeled off of what we won in the lawsuit for individual plaintiffs. And then also the CRO again would establish the Peace Book and the Peace Commissions, which I just spoke about. And so with that, I think we felt like it was also important to share what some of our challenges and wins have been. Some of our big challenges have been combating the narrative around gang and gun violence that allows for the criminalization of Black and brown people. So I was literally on a panel right before this where folks were like, I don't like defund. And I was like, oh, this is gonna be a tough one. And people are like, you know, I think hesitant around these kind of alternatives and proposals like getting rid of gang databases because they experience very real violence in their neighborhoods. And it's important for us not to invalidate that and also name that the gang database is a form of surveillance. It is not prevention, it is not interruption, it's not solving or halting crime before it happens. And so another challenge, sustaining capacity throughout our campaign. This has been a long-term fight that started in like 2017. It is now 2021, and we are still fighting for this thing. And I think, yeah, capacity and movement spaces, as you all probably understand, is just like an ebbing and flowing thing. Another challenge has been reform. The lawsuit was an example of a place where we had to make a hard decision about like, do we settle with the city that would like provide some relief to some people, but essentially like create reforms for what we're up against. And we chose against that because it was really important for us to maintain our stance that like the gang database needs to be abolished. And I think the other piece here too is that while we've done research, the OIG has done research, like all of these things have come out about the way the gang database does not work. Rather than getting rid of it, CPD and the city are looking for ways to reform it and make tweaks and make changes and institute a new one rather than get rid of this thing. And then lastly, making sure we don't create a better way to surveil us. The carve outs piece, like making sure that the ordinance is inclusive, making sure that our demands and the things that we're fighting for are inclusive so that we don't create more holes and harm for our communities in the long run. And I'll pass it back to Shanat.
Yeah, I want to leave it with some wins. I mean, there was some things to celebrate. We made enough noise for the OIG to conduct an investigation. It took a year long. They had a difficult time gathering data from the CPD, but it confirmed everything we had been saying up to that point. We have been creating an opportunity for visibility in other towns and cities. While we were engaged in the Chicago gang database, the Cook County gang database, we were able to delete and argue that, it's problematic and shouldn't exist. So at least we had one less database in Illinois so far. And then individual plaintiffs got compensation from the city acknowledging the mistake. And I think that's also, like we've been saying, it has helped also inform and create some momentum for our ordinance. And yeah, just why we think the database in Chicago is harmful: no due process, criminalization of specific groups of people, information is shared with hundreds of agencies, mind you, including the Chicago Public Schools was also one of the top ones that accessed it, and it is used to justify more policing, police interactions, and bigger budgets for themselves.
So that's the closeout of our presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I think we're on to the next presenter if we're not taking Q&A right now.
That's right. Well, what we're going to try and do is save the Q&A for after the third presentation, so we have a good sense of how much time we have and don't end up cutting off Julie since she's going third. So thank you for that. I really wanted to make sure that we grounded this in grassroots work, and you've done exactly that, that we think about, that gang suppression is often a proxy for racialized policing. And that is, I think, the way that it is spread through the nation and into immigration proceedings. Right? Immigration proceedings are a form of racism. And so they find common cause with gang suppression. And what began in some ways in a few urban centers has now spread nationally, so that, Georgia talks the most about, gangs, even though, from what I know about crime in Georgia, it does not look like crime in South LA. So that was great. Thank you very much. Now we're going to move on to the next presentation, which will be from Professor Glass, where we will get into a little bit more of at the national level. What has this focus on, or what has removal proceedings use of gang allegations actually looked like? So Professor Glass is a law professor at Tulane Law School in New Orleans, where she co-directs the Immigrant Rights Clinic. Her teaching and scholarship focus on the rights of immigrant children and detained immigrants. And among her many publications, Professor Glass is co-author of Deportation by Any Means Necessary, a national survey regarding gang allegations in immigration proceedings, which was published by the Immigrant Legal Resource Center in 2018. And I'll pass the mic to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. I feel honored to be in this group and be talking about these important issues. I'm going to also take a minute to try to share my screen. Let's see. There we go. Okay, great. So I'm Layla Halas. I use she, her pronouns. As Sean was saying, I teach and I direct the Immigrant Rights Clinic at Tulane in New Orleans. Although I've been practicing immigration law and teaching in several different cities for the past decade or so. And I'm kind of specifically focused on thinking about young people in the immigration legal system, and have worked a lot with young people. And thinking about the ways the immigration legal system has kind of historically and continues to be a project in kind of building racial hierarchies and kind of racist immigrant policing and what the implications are for that. And so some of the law review articles I've written recently are the school to deportation pipeline, thinking about how some of our laws really kind of push young people out of schools and into removal proceedings, and also the adultification of immigrant children. And I'm going to talk today about a report that Rachel Prandini of ILRC and I did several years ago. So I'm going to spend kind of most of my time talking about that, but I think you'll kind of hear a lot of overlap from what Shanad and Alex were talking about in a lot of different ways, and kind of tracking like how the database is working, the communication and collaboration between these different agencies, and then what the implications are on people's lives. And then I'll spend a couple of minutes just talking about like what I think the implications are now, since it is a few years since we did this survey and report. So I'll start out by saying the Immigration Nationality Act does not define gangs, even though it gets kind of thrown around in immigration court and immigration proceedings. There's not kind of this universal definition. DHS does kind of have some guidance that requires the association of 3 or more individuals. But there's no specific meaning when it gets kind of put into these, immigration police reports, the I-213 or other kinds of immigration notes. And in fact, as you may know, localities have all sorts of different definitions and have like long lists of factors that might implicate, whether they're going to say someone's gang affiliated, including like the clothes people wear, including like whose family members are, including what neighborhoods people live in. So those are, and also like, gang signs. And in my case, my client like had made a peace sign like on his social media, and that was somehow interpreted as a gang sign. So very broad definition. And then what we were seeing is a single school police officer, a single immigration agent, a single police officer on the street, writes something up, and that kind of gut reaction that someone has, again, often informed by kind of, racialized understandings of people's identities, that then gets written down and then can find its way into a database. It can be fed into the immigration legal system, and then has often devastating consequences for people. It can mean that people are, as you heard earlier, that their homes are kind of like violently raided, that they are then taken into custody, that they are denied bond in the immigration context and have to remain in immigrant detention, that they are denied an immigration benefit based on discretion, and then that they're ordered deported. So often that's what we were seeing, like what the implications were when gang affiliation allegations were kind of seeping into the system. And we also noted that, and people said this, the word gang affiliation and gang member were just like interchangeably being used. And so again, just really broad, kind of using in a very kind of broad manner by law enforcement. So I'm going to start talking about the kind of one young person's story that was shared in our report, and it really describes kind of like how this might happen and the ways that allegations are made, and the kind of confluence and interconnectedness of the kind of surveillance and law enforcement systems. So this is a young person who was in high school, and unbeknownst to him, someone he went to school with told the school police officer that they had heard from yet another person in high school that he was in a gang. So that got written up unbeknownst to him. He wasn't informed about it. He wasn't, disciplined about it. And then the school officer noted on a different day that he saw him standing near someone who the school officer believed was a gang member. So based on those kind of two things, the school police officer wrote up a report and sent it to a regional fusion center. So these are these like database centers created post 9/11 to collect information about threats to national security. So he's entered into this gang database. And then that information is shared with ICE. And so after that happens, his home is also ransacked. He is taken into custody. He is put into detention. In fact, his papers with his immigration lawyer's phone numbers were taken away. And so he didn't reach out for weeks until we kind of did some digging to figure out what's going on. And then we went in to request for him to be released on a bond. And ICE submitted this boilerplate kind of report, which we were seeing a lot of in the immigration courts at that time, just saying that he's a verified gang member. And then kind of like at the end, there were bullet points of the basis for the information that were kind of like hits in the system that the ICE officer had redacted. So it was a little bit harder for us to find out what the underlying accusations were. And then they also shared some pictures from Facebook. So the clothes he was wearing blue, anyone wearing blue, anyone wearing Chicago Bulls hat, and the Air Nikes. That was the evidence against him. There are also just some pictures, like I said, of him making the peace sign. And one of the pictures, like a later hearing, they were using as evidence, was actually wearing his like school jacket, which was blue and white, and they were trying to use that as evidence of gang membership. So, this is someone who was on his kind of pathway to get his residency based on, things that had happened to him. The judge denies bond, holds him no bond. And then when the residency application comes up, that's denied as well as a matter of discretion because the judge found that he was gang affiliated. So that kind of like shows you like a little bit about how it all works. I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the public discourse in the immigration setting. There have been kind of like anti-gang efforts in the Department of Homeland Security and ICE since the 1990s, operations where they're trying to target folks that they've identified as gang members. But we heard this, during the kind of Obama era, thinking about immigration enforcement priorities. And when he said, we have to focus on threats to our security, felons, not families, criminals, not children, gang members, not a mom working hard to provide for her kids. So like relying really heavily on this idea of like the good immigrants and the bad immigrants, and people who are kind of entangled in any way in the criminal legal system are disposable. And alongside that, actual immigration priorities, memorandum and ICE saying to kind of target people who have gang affiliation. And so that was the backdrop actually in which, my client and many other people were starting to be arrested. It was during that time. Although we saw a doubling down of it during the kind of Trump administration. Trump said that MS-13 gang members were exploiting loopholes in our laws to enter the country as unaccompanied minors. They look so innocent, they're not innocent, right? Former Attorney General Sessions said, we're working with the Department of Homeland Security and Health and Human Services to examine the unaccompanied minor issue and the exploitation of the program by gang members who come to this country as wolves in sheep's clothing. So, very loaded language, really trying to kind of amplify these racist narratives and targeting kind of like brown and Black children as gang members and therefore priorities for deportation. Okay, so that's the, maybe I'll just pause 1 minute. So that was kind of the backdrop of Rachel and I kind of hearing a lot from folks that they were seeing this come up more and more in court, and seeing more and more of like reports like this and other things. And so we did a survey starting in 2017 into 2018, and then wrote this report. And we heard, we primarily sent it out along kind of like nonprofit immigration attorney listservs, and had a little over 70 people from across the country complete it. And by and large, their observations were that gang allegations seemed to be on the rise at that time. They were seeing them more frequently. So, we asked them a number of questions, just like try to understand what folks were seeing. How is information coming into, immigration courts, into asylum offices, into, citizen and immigration services offices and their interviews. And it was coming through a lot of different ways. Sometimes there were police reports being submitted. Sometimes it was the I-213, which is like the immigration kind of police report when someone's encountered. A lot of time people were being shown pictures of social media. So just kind of officers doing their own kind of surveillance, taking pictures down, trying to find pictures. Sometimes evidence of a tattoo, no matter what the tattoo was being used as evidence of gang affiliation. Certainly people mentioned databases. Sometimes it's hard to know how the information got there. So people might not know that it came from a database. I had to do a lot of public records requests in order to figure out how the information had kind of made its way. So there's kind of no real transparency. That immigration courts or administrative courts are not like other courts where you have discovery, and there's a lot of kind of opaqueness, and then a lot of discretion given to the judge. Sometimes someone's own testimony was being used against them because they kind of said that they were, oftentimes people had asylum claims related to kind of like gang violence in their home country, or attempted kind of gang recruitment. And that was being used as a basis to say that they were affiliated with a gang, or they helped a gang, or if it was a family member who was a gang member, that was being used against them as well. So we were seeing kind of a wide variety of information seeping into various immigration proceedings. And as I mentioned, it was really across the board, across different parts of the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. We were seeing it in immigration courts, we were seeing it before USCIS, we were seeing it as well in asylum offices. Bond hearings were very frequently the ways people were seeing it come up, arguing that someone was a threat to the community because they were somehow gang affiliated, and then judges denying bond. But also for all sorts of benefits. For asylum, people were being denied asylum because it's a discretionary benefit, so they could meet all the other requirements. But saying in one case, the court said that they didn't find someone credible because of their gang involvement, which is again another kind of often necessary to kind of prove your case, but also because these different things are discretionary, they're being denied. DACA adjustment, that refers to people trying to become legal permanent residents, green card holders. So all different types of applications. And then we were seeing it, as I said, like coming up in terms of testimony. And so there would be questions like, do you have a tattoo? Pictures of social media. Who are these people? Sometimes pictures of people they didn't even know, like, do you know who these people are? And there'd be pictures of other people that ICE believed were gang members. Who are these people? And then questions about, particularly for folks who had asylum claims based on gang violence in their home country, what did you ever do for the gangs? Did you ever give them money if they were charging, communities and folks in the neighborhood for kind of safety? Like, did you pay them? Were you then part of the gang? And so questions along those lines. And so our report dove into like other parts of the kind of immigration system, but I was just kind of say big picture, you know, the concerns folks have were, you know, concerns that folks here have voiced, that you're really criminalizing communities. You're criminalizing just like regular teenage behavior. Also just the fact that you're, you know, Black or Latinx and a boy of a certain age, there's going to be almost a presumption against you. And then you have to prove a negative. And there's no kind of definitions for really what you're proving anyway. So these were some of the things that folks said to us. Gang allegations make it easier for the government to criminalize and deport people. Social media is being used to allege facts and then judges are just accepting it. You know, that it's racist. And so, you know, these are trends that we see in immigration court in all sorts of ways. It's not that it's so far afield from what normally happens in immigration court. It's often par for the course. But very specifically, gang allegations were being used in this way to disproportionately impact young people, immigrants of color, you know, just for being young people. Okay, so I was going to just talk a little bit about, so that was the report. You can find it online if you're interested in it, and there are kind of more details about what people were seeing at that time in 2018. We also wrote a practice advisory for people who are practicing in immigration court with AILA. Happy to talk about that as well. Kind of strategies people were using to challenge those, like in the immigration court proceedings. Certainly at that time, there wasn't as much research being done about kind of gang-based databases nationally, but we were relying heavily on audits done on Cal gangs and reports written about Cal gangs at that time. Okay, so fast forward to today. And, you know, I will say that, you know, recent ICE enforcement priorities memo does also prioritize, you know, gang associations. There are interim ICE priorities that were published in February, and those who pose a threat to public safety, including those who may have participated in certain gang activities, are a priority for deportation. So we're seeing a continuation of prioritization of gang affiliation in the immigration system. But I would say there is some good news. So, you know, one piece of like recent-ish news, there was this litigation in California. A bunch of young people were kind of mass arrested and put in detention after having been released from the Office of Refugee and Resettlement. They were taken and kind of on the basis of these gang allegations. Within a month after the litigation, almost the vast majority were released. And recently a settlement has come out of that, and the settlement is final. As a result, USCIS, Citizen and Immigration Services, is not supposed to revoke someone's special immigrant juvenile status. So that's like a status, it's a pathway to residency. They're not supposed to revoke it in whole or in part based on the immigration agency saying like gang affiliation wasn't being taken into account in the underlying findings, the predicate order findings. So that was an area where people were seeing a lot of denials related to gangs. Also, class members have the right to a hearing if they are rearrested after being released from ORR within a week for a bond. And then there are certain rights related to other immigration applications, T visas for those who've, you know, been trafficked, U visas for those who have experienced certain crimes as well. They're not supposed to be kind of denied in that same way. And then I think kind of bigger picture and like the bookends of my presentation, like more like a brighter spot is just the kind of advocacy and organizing that's happening right now. And I just feel like there is a lot more public awareness of the widespread surveillance that's happening, of the interconnectedness of these different agencies, and how racialized policing is being amplified and multiplied through these different networks. And just having public awareness about that is really important. It obviously can achieve the kind of change that Shanad and Alex were talking about earlier. But I also think it's important for kind of the mainstream immigrant rights groups, and hopefully as there are pushes for different kind of legislative changes and reforms, people will, I hope, kind of be more informed about giving up the rights of some parts of the community, and will push back more when there are kind of when folks who may have gang affiliations or alleged membership, or all those communities will hopefully not be carved out of protections in the same way that they long have been. So that's my hope, and I'm really excited to hear more from Julie as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. So I was hoping maybe that we'd see a little bit more in the federal immigration prosecutors, but I guess that's something. Back to the Obama is not necessary. Obama era is not, back to the Obama era is not, what we're trying to do. But I will say, just to connect the dots between those last two presentations, is that I have found that with electeds, when you show them the audit from the Chicago gang database or the audit of the Cal gang database, and that when you have independent audits of these things, they're just completely indefensible. And that there are hopefully people at the federal level who'll be receptive to hearing now that even if you want to prioritize the deportation of gang members, you got to at least get that part right, who are people who are gang involved. I've done about expert testimony on about a dozen cases now, where they're all, people have Mexican national soccer tattoos and they're accused of being Mexican mafia tattoos. Things that are just not right. I even had one guy who had a crown, right? It was obviously a Latin Kings gang tattoo. And they put down that it was a Mara Salvatrucha tattoo, because even when they were right, they were wrong. The next session I'll be hosting actually will also be talking particularly about how gang experts get it wrong. So I'm going to invite you all to that too. But yeah, without any more from me, we would like to hear next from Julie Mao. Julie is part of a very exciting, relatively new organization that I hope will be part of her presentation. She's with the Just Futures Law. Just Futures Law is a public interest law firm launched to meet the needs of the immigrants' rights movement. Just Futures works in partnership with immigrant and racial justice organizers and base building groups, and engages in impact litigation, policy work, and works to build a political home for lawyers and legal workers. And the more I find out about it, the more I feel like it's a model for what we do at the Peace and Justice Law Center on the West Coast. Julie is Deputy Director of Just Futures. She's represented immigrants in civil rights litigation against law enforcement abuse and labor exploitation, and has worked with hundreds of directly impacted community members to stop their deportations. Recently, she's been engaged in legal strategies challenging migrant prosecutions, technology-based policing, and local police collusion with ICE. So thank you, Julie, for joining us, and I'll let you take it over from here.
Oh, thank you, Sean. That's a lot of hype. And thank you so much for inviting me and to be in community with my fellow speakers. I feel like I have known many of you for years now, both in New Orleans and in Chicago. And yeah, just like super privileged to be in space with you all. And when I heard, saw the email outreach from Sean, I was kind of like, oh, I think Shanat and Alex can, do the legal side of my presentation around gang databases and tech, because just the level of knowledge and strategy that you guys have built in this multi-year campaign to dismantle the CPD gang database and invest in communities, it's just really beautiful to witness and support. But so yeah, just super quickly, maybe I'll I don't have a slideshow, and I am hoping I can get us done by 10 to 15 minutes. So there is enough time for you all to ask questions of me, but I think most importantly, the organizers in the room. But I'll just type a little bit of a flow of what I'm hoping to talk about, and maybe truncate some of it, because I think my prior presenters have really touched on a lot of it. So when I was speaking to Shana about, what to sort of emphasize and talk about, I think, one of the things we discussed was actually, how do we reach sort of strategy, a defensive and affirmative strategy to attack the system, because the consequences for individuals is just so devastating. You're talking about being first policed, then having an immigration consequence, and potential permanent removal from the United States. And so, I wanted to sort of highlight the example of Wilmer Catalan Ramirez, whom was an OCAD member that Shanat had mentioned before, who, at the time, this was, the first couple of months of the Trump administration, I remember getting a frantic call from OCAD being like, this crazy raid happened. There were about 10 agents who basically busted into this person's house. They didn't knock. They didn't have a criminal warrant. They were conducting one of these so-called Trump, but like Layla was saying, Obama era created, ICE raid with a big press release and, hundreds of people arrested. And they broke his shoulder during the arrest. And that was because at the time, Wilmer was recovering from a gunshot wound to the head and to the shoulder. That left him partially paralyzed, and he could not walk from his bed when the ICE agents asked him to get up and assume the arrest position. And they, were heavily during the whole process, when we were started asking questions, accusing him of being this huge gang threat. And, at the time, because we are a movement lawyering institution, we had worked with a number of communities across the US around some of these gang labeling issues from an immigration background. And so, I don't think we were looking to sue. I think we were looking to get what we could and get him free from detention, especially with all the health issues that he was suffering from. But, we started digging and like Layla was saying, doing public records requests, figuring out what were these gang allegations, and finally, brought a lawsuit around 4th and 5th Amendment and 14th Amendment issues that later was able to reveal that, the gang labeling that happened was through one interaction as he was, in front of his neighbor's house, playing with the kids were playing, and the police stopped the whole family for loitering. And he was initially placed on that gang database for simply being in a high gang activity area. The second time was a police traffic stop, stopped in a high gang area as well. And he was placed on the police database through a police report. That instance curiously labeled and designated as a different gang, and actually the rival gang. And so when we litigated and brought this case, there were clear issues that we could even point to in our current lawsuit that showed sort of the racist stereotyping ways, and really just how this gang sort of data, which is just a composition of police reports and street harassment and stop and frisk, was really based on a lot of racial profiling and compounding of the policing of Black and Latinx communities. You know, and these sort of stories of folks deeply harmed by gang labeling or gang accusations that end up in a database, you know, continue today. We have been working with some folks in DC, where we also experience large amounts of gang-related, quote, ICE raids, where folks, you know, DACA recipients, status was revoked and them arrested because some school resource officer claimed years ago that he admitted to him that, you know, as a high school kid, they were gang affiliated. So I can chat in some of those complaints and articles so you can kind of see you know, some of the facts of how this happens. And then, you know, in terms of how do gang allegations show up in policing, and then how do they end up with ICE? You know, I think that what folks have said definitely runs true with the groups and communities that we work with. It comes in the form of gang allegations and stop and frisk cards, police reports, school resource officer notes. In New York City, I think, you know, before they had this iteration of the gang database, they used to have, each sort of district used to have these like physical gang books, and they would insert their notes into that sort of physical book that they had. And it's important, because I'm going to shift a little bit around thinking about sort of this next generation of what these databases are becoming. It's important to understand that the gang database isn't something that is somehow somehow special, right? Like, I think when people think of database, people think like technology, and there's like some sort of sophisticated way that these law enforcement agencies are somehow uploading the information, vetting the information. Really, it's a data platform that collects the street harassment, the police misconduct, you know, the stop and frisk cards, the police reports that, you know, a police department creates and funnels it into a particular data system. And so just to illustrate what I'm saying is, you know, I think in California, you know, there is this thing called the Cal Gangs database. Like when I talk to Sean, I feel like, or ILRC, and folks in California, there does feel like a database that you sign on to, that, you know, you can search and list a person. In so many other places, the gang database isn't actually like an actual database. It is a way to query the larger criminal data system. And so that's kind of how I think about it in Chicago, for example, where there's a data warehouse called Clear, and the way that sort of the gang database is consolidated, you know, somebody's on the gang list, is just querying that Clear database. And so it's important to understand that, because, you know, one of the things that we sort of deal with constantly is, you know, how does a police interaction that's, you know, a itty bitty loitering drop charge end up leading to an immigrant's deportation, an ICE raid, and a broken shoulder, and somebody's detention and deportation. And a lot of that is really the data sharing and sort of the mass surveillance that starts with human surveillance that ends up being collected in some sort of criminal justice database and then shared with multiple local and federal law enforcement agencies. So how does you know, local police at this point share this type of gang-related data? So I'm just going to hopefully be able to type this in. And apologies that there's some formatting errors due to Zoom. So some of the data sharing, you know, there's definitely the direct data sharing, right? Like the folks in Chicago, you know, a lot of the reports have been showing sort of how, for example, you know, ICE calls CPD and it's like, hey, is this person accused, an accused gang member in CPD's gang database? That's the type of direct sharing that can happen, that frequently happens. And certainly happens in the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia area where I reside. The other way that it happens is through uploading this data and or sharing it with other state, federal, and criminal justice data platforms. So I think folks have also talked about the Fusion Center. And so what happens is that there are these sort of platforms in each local or state sort of law enforcement entity. I feel like, you know, the LA Sheriff's Office is definitely a notorious one for like building some of these types of regional or participating in some of these regional database sharing programs. But basically what's going on is that, you know, for example, if you look at the Intercept article, you can see like emails from DC police with the Maryland Fusion Center, where the Fusion Center is like, hey, can you like download that gang database list? Like make a list of all the individuals in your records that have gang allegations. Can you put it in a CSV file, which is like an Excel spreadsheet compatible file, and send it to me so I can upload it into RISNet, which is a type of data platform that Fusion Centers use to then share that data to hundreds, if not thousands, of agencies, including immigration and customs enforcement. And so that's in large part a lot of the way that these gang databases or the gang information is being shared. And then the last category that I think is emerging, but we are definitely disturbed by it, is the beginnings of private company data buying and data selling of criminal records data. You know, GangNet is a company, right, that sells, like the corporatization of the criminal justice system has been something that's been happening for decades, including in the building of gang databases. The one in DC is actually, the platform was built, I think, originally, I believe, by Microsoft. You know, the corporatization of these systems has been growing for a while. But I think the last couple of years, it's just like, because of technology, ramped up tremendously. And so we are tracking companies like Apris, which is based out of Kentucky, which is basically buying and selling this criminal justice data, you know, by the millions and, you know, hundreds of millions of individuals. And at this point, companies like that can literally, are able to literally track people in real time, whether they're like in jail and when they'll be released, and just incredibly invasive and personal information, including, you know, what police have said about them and whatever allegations around gang affiliation. And so what are we seeing in terms of, you know, this next generation of sort of police public safety threat list creation? And we kind of really think of the gang database as, you know, something that could be turned in the future. Like I think Alex was talking about, like, we want to make sure we don't have, we do our organizing in a way that stops the criminalization and doesn't move it and have it transform into something else. And, you know, I think our concerns is that as we fight against and sort of disavow and discredit the gang database, the police will shift to other types of labeling. So instead of gang list, it'll be, for example, in Chicago, you know, the strategic subject list. And so there's all these companies now that, you know, instead of the very vague gang criteria, are creating other types of vague data criteria to justify saying this person is a threat. And so I'm just gonna put in here sort of a really good GitHub resource by Upturn, kind of talking about and naming what we call, sort of the predictive policing, right? Like being in a gang is not illegal, as Alex said. These sort of lists are trying to say this is a dangerous person based on this data. Have they done anything? No, and they're trying to sort of criminalize and ask the police, prosecutors, society to sort of criminalize individuals before they have taken any action. And also, these are not, real community solutions. They are about, suppressing and using law enforcement activity against individuals. So we're talking about, secret data platforms such as Predpol, systems created by Palantir. And I think, the thing to understand about all these sort of databases or gang allegations is I like to at times quote Justice Gorsuch and one of his 10th Circuit former opinions about like garbage in and garbage out. Like this is crap. This data is crap. And now, what they're trying to do is create databases and use, sell like a data tech algorithm that washes that bias. But really in the reality is what it spits out is still garbage. And the last point I will say is that, in terms of solutions and strategies, I really want to echo what the Erase the Database Coalition said about like just a really multifaceted strategy around both organizing and litigation that involves not just reports, not just litigation, like legislation at the local and county level. I think that as lawyers sometimes, we brought this litigation, we helped this one person get released from jail, get his immigration relief, and get a affirmative letter from CPD saying he was not gang affiliated. But that didn't dismantle the entire system, right? Like, what does it take to take everybody off the gang database? And so I definitely want to echo all the amazing organizing that's been happening in Chicago in trying to create such a multi-tactical way of dismantling the system. So I'll leave it there.